It began with the ice, a relentless and iron-hard sheet that had turned the East River into a frozen wasteland, silencing the churn of the water and bringing the heartbeat of two great cities to a stuttering halt. The year was 1852, though some accounts suggest the particularly brutal freeze that broke the camel's back happened later, but the frustration was timeless. In the mid-19th century, New York and Brooklyn were not merely boroughs united under a single municipal flag. They were twin giants separated by a turbulent saltwater estuary that was technically not a river at all, but a tidal strait of notoriously complex currents. On one side stood New York, the teeming vertical engine of commerce rising frantically on the narrow island of Manhattan. On the other sat Brooklyn, the city of homes, of churches, and of sprawling quietude, rapidly expanding, but forever looking across the water at its louder sibling. Connecting them was a fleet of ferries, reliable enough in fair weather, but utterly at the mercy of the elements when the Atlantic winter descended with its full fury. On this particular day, the ferries were trapped. Thousands of commuters, bundled in wool and tweed, stamped their feet on the wooden piers, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they watched the white ice floes crash against the hulls of the stranded boats. Among those trapped in the icy purgatory was a man named John Augustus Roebling. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. A German immigrant with a gaze as intense as a hawk and a mind that operated with the precision of the heavy machinery he designed, Roebling was already a legend in civil engineering circles, though the wider world had yet to fully grasp the magnitude of his genius. As he stood there, shivering in the bitter wind, unable to cross from Brooklyn to Manhattan, the delay was not merely an inconvenience. To a mind like Roebling's, it was an inefficiency, a structural flaw in the design of civilization that required a solution. It is said that in those freezing hours, staring out at the white expanse of the East River, the impossible idea crystallized in his mind. He would not just build a bridge, he would build the greatest bridge the world had ever seen, a structure so massive, so high, and so strong that it would mock the ice and the tides below. To understand the audacity of this thought, one must understand the era. In the mid-1800s, bridges were made of stone or iron, and they had limits. The East River was wide, bustling with the tallest masted ships of the global merchant fleet. A bridge could not sit low on the water, or it would block the lifeblood of commerce. It had to soar. And to span such a distance without clogging the river with piers required a suspension bridge of a scale that most engineers deemed physically impossible. But Roebling was not like most engineers. He had studied in Berlin under the great philosopher Hegel, who had taught him that the spiritual and the material could be united, and he had brought that philosophical rigor to the wild frontiers of America. He had made his fortune not just by building, but by reinventing the very material of construction. He was the father of wire rope in America. Before Roebling, hemp ropes were the standard for hauling barges and mining cars, but hemp frayed, rotted, and snapped. Roebling had developed a method of twisting iron wires into a cable of immense strength and flexibility. It was this wire rope that he believed could span the East River. The proposal he eventually drafted was met with skepticism that bordered on ridicule. He proposed a bridge with a central span of 1,600 feet, 50% longer than any suspension bridge then in existence. He envisioned two massive Gothic towers built of granite and limestone, rising out of the water like cathedral spires, standing taller than almost anything in New York except the spire of Trinity Church. From these towers would drape 4 steel cables, not iron but steel, a metal that was still relatively new and untested in such massive structural applications. These cables would hold a roadway that would carry not just carriages and pedestrians, but railway cars, creating a unified artery between the two cities. Critics called it a bridge to nowhere or a fleeting fancy. They argued that the winds would tear it down, that the weight would collapse the towers, or that the cost would bankrupt the cities. But Roebling was relentless. He was a man of cold logic and fiery determination. A strict vegetarian who believed in hydrotherapy and worked with a terrifying intensity. He lobbied politicians, wooed investors, and produced calculations so dense and precise that they bludgeoned the opposition into silence. By 1867, the New York State Legislature passed a bill chartering the New York Bridge Company, and Roebling was appointed chief engineer. It seemed the dream was finally becoming concrete reality. He set to work surveying the site, determining exactly where the massive caissons, the foundations for the towers, would be sunk into the riverbed. It was June of 1869, a summer day that promised progress. Roebling was standing at the edge of the Fulton ferry slip in Brooklyn, peering through his surveying instruments to fix the precise alignment of the bridge. He was so absorbed in his work, so focused on the line of sight that would define the future skyline, that he did not notice the ferry arriving. The boat, heavily laden and carried by the tide, bumped hard against the piling where Roebling stood. The wooden fender crushed his foot, trapping his toes between the logs. It was a gruesome injury, but in the context of heavy construction, it did not initially seem fatal. He was rushed to a doctor, and his crushed toes were amputated. For a man of his constitution, this should have been a temporary setback. However, John Roebling was a man who distrusted modern medicine. He believed in the water cure. He ordered that his wounded foot be treated only with the continuous pouring of water, day and night. He dismissed the doctors and took charge of his own recovery, just as he had taken charge of every engineering project in his life. But biology is not engineering. Tetanus, the silent killer of the age, set in. The infection seized his jaw, then his body. In the throes of lockjaw, suffering agonizing seizures, the great visionary who had conceived the bridge lay dying in a room in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the river he sought to conquer. Before he died, barely able to speak, he transferred the burden of his dream to the only person he trusted to understand the complexities of the design, his son, Washington Roebling. Washington was 32 years old, a Civil War veteran who had built bridges for the Union Army under enemy fire. He was brilliant, quiet, and intimately familiar with his father's plans, but he lacked his father's imperious aura. When John Roebling died in July 1869, the shockwave went through the project. The mastermind was gone before a single stone had been laid. The press and the public wondered if the boy could fill the giant's shoes. Washington, grieving and under immense pressure, did not hesitate. He knew that the most dangerous part of the construction lay immediately ahead, the sinking of the caissons. To build the towers, they had to go down. They had to dig deep into the riverbed to find solid rock or stable sand upon which to rest the millions of tons of granite. To do this, Roebling designed massive wooden boxes, caissons, that were essentially bottomless diving bells. These were titanic structures, built of yellow pine timbers, 12 feet thick on the roof, heavily caulked and lined with iron to be airtight. The plan was to tow these wooden behemoths out into the river, sink them to the bottom, and then pump them full of compressed air. The air pressure would keep the river water out, allowing men to descend into the wooden chamber at the bottom of the river and dig the mud out by hand. As they dug, the caisson would sink deeper and deeper under the weight of the granite stones being laid on top of it until it hit bedrock. Then the interior would be filled with concrete, becoming the permanent foundation. It sounded sound in theory, a triumph of physics. In practice, it was a descent into hell. The Brooklyn Caisson was the first to be launched. It was an acre in size, a dark, damp, subterranean kingdom of compressed air. Men, mostly immigrants desperate for work, would descend through an airlock, a small iron chamber that equalized the pressure. As the air hissed in, their ears would pop, their voices would become tinny and strange due to the density of the atmosphere, and the heat would rise. Inside the caisson, under the river, the air was thick, humid, and illuminated only by the flickering light of calcium lamps, and later primitive gas lights. The work was brutal. Men stood in muck up to their knees, swinging picks and shovels, clearing boulders that blocked the caisson's cutting edge. When they encountered a boulder too large to move, they had to blast it. Black powder was too smoky, so Washington Roebling made the terrifying decision to use dynamite in the compressed air environment, a risk that could have blown the foundation of the bridge to splinters. Washington was not an armchair engineer. He spent more time in the caisson than anyone else, supervising the blasting, checking the air pressure, and solving crises as they arose. But there was a danger lurking in the compressed air that no one fully understood at the time. The workers began to fall ill. They complained of severe joint pain, paralysis, numbness, and in some cases they collapsed and died. They called it Grecian bends because of the way the pain made sufferers arch their backs, resembling the posture of women in fashionable Greek period statues of the time. Today, we know it as decompression sickness, or the bends. The cause of this mysterious affliction was entirely unknown to the doctors of the 1870s. They did not understand that when a human body breathes compressed air, the nitrogen in the air dissolves into the blood and tissues. As long as the pressure remains high, the nitrogen stays in solution, harmless. But if the pressure is released too quickly, if a worker ascends from the bottom of the river to the surface in a matter of minutes, the nitrogen comes out of the solution in the form of bubbles, much like opening a bottle of champagne. These bubbles block blood vessels, tear through tissues, and lodge in joints, causing excruciating agony. In severe cases, they can paralyze the spine or stop the heart. Washington Roebling watched his men suffer, his own body aching with the early warning signs of the disease, yet the work could not stop. The caisson was sinking inch by painful inch, but the riverbed was fighting back. They encountered not just mud, but boulders the size of carriages, remnants of the glaciers that had carved the harbor eons ago. Inside the wooden tomb, the atmosphere was surreal. The air pressure distorted sounds so much that men could not whistle. The density of the air made it impossible to purse one's lips effectively. Candles, if used, burned with a frantic, accelerated brightness and then would smoke furiously, filling the chamber with soot that coated the men's lungs. If a flame was blown out, it could spontaneously reignite due to the abundance of oxygen. This heightened flammability led to one of the most terrifying episodes in the bridge's construction. One afternoon, a worker using a candle to inspect a leak in the timber roof of the caisson accidentally ignited the oakum caulking. The fire was small at first, creeping unseen into the hairline cracks between the massive 12-inch timbers. In the compressed air, the fire did not behave normally. It burrowed. It ate its way deep into the wood, traveling upwards through the layers of the ceiling, hidden from view. When the smoke was finally detected, panic ensued, but it was a controlled panic. There was nowhere to run. Washington Roebling remained in the caisson, directing the fight against the invisible enemy. They pumped water and steam into the holes, trying to drown the fire, but the compressed air simply blew the water back. The fire was feeding on the timber that held the entire weight of the stone tower above. If the roof burned through, the river would rush in, drowning everyone, or the tower would collapse, crushing them. For hours, Roebling struggled in the thick, poisonous smoke, refusing to leave until he collapsed from exhaustion. He was hauled to the surface, gasping, but the fire continued to smolder. Realizing that the structure was at risk of total failure, Roebling made the heartbreaking decision to flood the caisson. He ordered the pumps to stop and the airlocks to be opened. The East River poured in, filling the chamber and ruining months of work, but it was the only way to suffocate the flames. It took weeks to pump the water back out and dry the chamber. When they finally re-entered, the damage was grotesque. The fire had honeycombed the massive timbers, turning solid wood into charcoal. Carpenters had to spend months chiseling out the burnt wood from overhead, filling the voids with fresh concrete, working upside down in the pressurized gloom. It was a setback that would have broken a lesser man, but Washington pressed on. By 1871, the Brooklyn Caisson finally hit a depth of 44.5 feet. It wasn't bedrock, but the sand was compacted and hard enough to support the tower. They filled the great wooden room with concrete, burying it forever beneath the floor of the river. The Brooklyn Tower began to rise into the sky, solid and gray, a monument to the suffering below. But the ordeal was far from over. Across the water, on the Manhattan side, the conditions were even worse. The riverbed there was deeper and softer. To reach firm footing, the New York caisson had to go down to 78 feet, nearly double the depth of the Brooklyn side. This meant higher air pressure, and with higher pressure came a dramatic increase in the danger of the bends. As the depth increased, the casualty count rose. Men began to die. The work shifts were shortened to 4 hours, then 2, but the toll continued. Washington Roebling, trying to lead by example, spent more time in the high-pressure chamber than anyone. He was pushing his body beyond the limits of human endurance, driven by the ghost of his father and the weight of the city's expectations. One afternoon in 1872, the inevitable happened. Washington collapsed. The bends had struck him with a ferocity that left him partially paralyzed, blind in one eye, and in constant, racking pain. He was carried from the site, his active career as a field engineer over. He was 35 years old, invalid, and the bridge was barely a quarter finished. The press, who had always been skeptical, circled like sharks. They whispered that the project was doomed, that the killer bridge had claimed both father and son. There was talk of replacing him, of bringing in a new engineer who would scrap the Roebling plans. But Washington Roebling possessed a mental fortitude that matched the steel of his cables. He refused to resign. He retreated to his home in Brooklyn Heights, to a room with a bay window that overlooked the river. From his bed, often too weak to lift his head, he used a telescope to watch the construction. It was here that the third hero of the bridge emerged, a figure who had been in the shadows but now stepped into the light, Emily Roebling, Washington's wife. In an era when women were expected to concern themselves with domestic affairs and leave engineering to men, Emily became the bridge's surrogate chief engineer. She was a woman of extraordinary intellect and diplomacy. Realizing that her husband could no longer physically visit the site or attend meetings, she began to take his instructions to the assistant engineers. But she did not just act as a messenger. She studied. She learned the mathematics of catenary curves, the strength of materials, stress analysis, and cable construction. She became so proficient that many of the engineers believed she was the one actually directing the work. She navigated the treacherous political waters, charming the trustees, answering the critics, and shielding her husband from the stress that threatened to kill him. With Emily as the conduit and Washington as the mind, the great towers continued to rise. By 1876, the granite towers stood complete, 276 feet above the water, their Gothic arches framing the sky. They were the most massive things on the North American continent, ancient in style but modern in purpose. Now came the most delicate and visible phase of the construction, the spinning of the cables. Unlike modern bridges, where cables are fabricated in a factory and lifted into place, the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge had to be spun in mid-air, wire by single wire. But first, a connection had to be made. A single wire rope had to be strung across the river to connect the two towers. On August 14, 1876, a steam tug pulled a scow across the river, unspooling a 3/4-inch wire rope that was then hoisted up over the towers. When it was pulled taut, rising from the water to hang in a glistening arc between the cities, a cheer went up from the crowds watching on the ferry boats. It was the first physical link between New York and Brooklyn. Soon, a traveler rope was set up, a continuous loop that could carry men and materials back and forth. To show the public that the bridge was safe, the master mechanic E.F. Farrington performed a stunt that is still remembered. He sat on a simple bosun's chair, a wooden plank suspended from the wire, and allowed himself to be pulled across the expanse of the river, hundreds of feet in the air. As he flew over the masts of the ships below, waving his hat to the thousands of spectators, it looked like a spider suspended on a thread against the vast blue sky. It was a moment of pure magic, a signal that the impossible was happening. But the romance of the high wire belied the danger of the work that followed. To spin the main cables, the workers had to build a temporary footbridge that swooped down between the towers. It was a narrow, slat-wood path with only a thin handrail, swaying violently in the wind. Men, known as wiremen, had to walk this path day after day, in freezing winter gales and scorching summer heat. A misstep meant a fall of 130 feet into the hard water of the East River. It was said that the wiremen developed a peculiar gait, a rolling walk that counteracted the sway of the bridge. They were a breed apart, often sailors or riggers who were used to heights, but even for them, the bridge was a terrifying beast. The spinning process was ingenious. A large wheel, like a bicycle wheel, traveled back and forth across the river, pulling a loop of steel wire from a massive spool in Brooklyn to the anchorage in New York. Back and forth, day after day, the wheel traveled, laying wire after wire. Each wire was as thin as a pencil, but when thousands were bundled together, they formed a cable nearly 16 inches in diameter. There were 4 main cables, and each one contained 5,434 individual wires. The precision required was staggering. Each wire had to have the exact same tension. If one was too loose, it would not carry its share of the load. If too tight, it might snap. Washington, watching through his telescope, could spot a wire that was sagging just a few inches too low from a mile away, and would send Emily to correct the assistant engineers. However, corruption and greed are never far from great public works. In 1878, a scandal broke that threatened the structural integrity of the entire bridge. it was discovered that the contractor supplying the steel wire, a man named J. Lloyd Hay, had been defrauding the bridge company. He had been supplying rejected, brittle wire that had failed the strength tests. To hide his crime, he had his men switch the tags from the good wire to the bad after the inspectors had left. By the time the deception was uncovered, tons of this inferior wire had already been spun into the cables, inextricably bound with the good steel. When the news of the fraudulent wire reached Washington Roebling in his sick room, the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of potential catastrophe. For a lesser engineer, or a structure designed with thinner margins, this deception by J. Lloyd Hay could have meant the condemnation of the bridge. It would have required unwrapping the thousands of wires already spun, dismantling the work of years, and admitting a failure so colossal it would have ended the project. But Washington Roebling, like his father before him, was a man of excessive caution. He had designed the bridge not just to hold the weight it was expected to carry, but to hold 6 times that amount. This factor of safety was his insurance policy against the unknown, against hurricanes, against the marching rhythm of armies, and, as it turned out, against the greed of men. Calculations were made in the dim light of the Columbia Heights bedroom. Roebling determined that even with the brittle wire woven into the strands, the cables were still strong enough to hold 5 times the maximum load. The bridge would stand. However, he was not a man to let a crime go unpunished or a flaw go uncorrected. He ordered that the contractor be forced to supply additional good wire at his own expense. This extra wire was added to the remaining cables, thickening them slightly beyond the original design, a hidden scar of corruption that the bridge would carry forever. The public was largely kept in the dark about the severity of the issue to prevent panic, and the great spinning wheels continued their hypnotic journey back and forth across the river, sealing the bad wire inside the good, wrapping it all in a protective casing of soft iron wire until the cables looked like solid cylinders of steel. By the autumn of 1878, the 4 main cables were finished. They hung low and heavy, a permanent drape of steel against the clouds. Now began the work of the superstructure, hanging the roadway from these cables. This was the phase where the bridge began to look like a bridge. Iron clamps were attached to the main cables, and from these clamps hung vertical wire ropes known as suspenders. These suspenders were like the strings of a harp, dropping down to hold the steel floor beams that would support the deck. As the floor beams were hoisted up from the river barges and bolted into place, the bridge began to extend outward from the towers, a growing skeleton reaching over the water. It was during this phase that the unique genius of the Roebling design became visible to the naked eye. Most suspension bridges rely solely on vertical suspenders, but John Roebling had distrusted the wind. He had seen other suspension bridges twist and gallop in high winds until they tore themselves apart. To prevent this, he introduced a system of diagonal stays, cables that radiated downward from the tops of the towers like the rays of a sun, crisscrossing the vertical suspenders. These stays created a rigid triangular truss system, a web of steel that made the bridge incredibly stiff and resistant to the aerodynamic forces that would doom the Tacoma Narrows Bridge decades later. To the engineer, these diagonal stays were a structural necessity. To the artist and the poet, they were a masterstroke of beauty. They turned the bridge into a vast steel spiderweb, a geometric lace that seemed to shift and change as one moved across the river. But beauty in construction is often purchased with blood. The higher the bridge rose, the more dangerous the work became. The men working on the suspended superstructure were balancing on narrow iron beams, hundreds of feet above the water, often with no safety harnesses. The wind whistling through the wires was a constant companion, numbing fingers and tearing at coats. The workers, many of them Irish and German immigrants, veterans of the Caissons or former sailors, had developed a fatalistic camaraderie. They knew the odds. They knew that gravity was a patient hunter. There were slips. A wrench dropped from that height would whistle like a bullet and could punch a hole through the deck of a ship below. A man dropped from that height hit the water with a force that shattered bones. In one tragic incident, a group of men were working on a suspended platform when a lug bolt snapped. The platform tilted, dumping the men into the void. Those who watched from the ferries saw bodies tumbling through the air, limbs flailing, before disappearing into the gray chop of the East River. Some survived the fall only to drown. Others were killed on impact. Each accident was reported in the papers, adding to the bridge's reputation as a voracious beast that demanded human sacrifice. The official death count varies, with numbers ranging from 20 to over 30, but the reality of 19th century record-keeping means we may never know exactly how many souls the bridge claimed. Through all this, Washington Roebling remained a prisoner in his own home. His condition fluctuated. There were days when he could dictate letters to Emily, and days when the mere sound of a voice was like a physical blow. He developed a hypersensitivity to sensory input. The light hurt his eyes, so he sat in semi-darkness. The chatter of visitors was unbearable. He became a recluse, a man in the iron mask of his own making, ruling his empire of steel and stone through written notes and the voice of his wife. The psychological toll was immense. He was building the most public structure in America while living the most private of lives. He could see the progress through his telescope, the tiny figures of men walking on the cables, the steam puffs from the engines, but he could not touch the cold granite or feel the vibration of the wire. He was the mind detached from the body. Emily Roebling, conversely, was everywhere. She had become the de facto project manager. The assistant engineers respected her, not just out of deference to her husband, but because she knew the bridge. She mediated disputes, inspected the materials, and represented the Roebling interests to the Board of Trustees, a group of politicians and businessmen who were constantly bickering over costs and timelines. There were attempts to oust Washington, to replace the invalid engineer with someone more presentable, someone who could shake hands and attend banquets. In 1882, remarkably close to the bridge's completion, the mayor of Brooklyn led a motion to fire Washington Roebling for neglect of duty.
It was Emily who saved him. She went to the American Society of Civil Engineers. She went to the trustees, and she delivered a defense of her husband that was so eloquent, so grounded in the technical realities of the project, that the motion was defeated. She was the first woman to address the society, breaking a barrier just as significant as the stone towers breaking the skyline. It was an open secret among the workers that Mrs. Roebling was the one running the show, and they tipped their hats to her with genuine respect when she walked the swaying footbridge, her long skirts gathered in her hand, the wind tearing at her bonnet. As 1883 approached, the bridge was finally taking its final form. The roadway was laid, a broad avenue divided into lanes. In the center was an elevated promenade for pedestrians, a stroke of democratic genius by John Roebling. He had explicitly designed the bridge so that the people, the walkers, the strollers, the lovers, would be elevated above the carriage traffic and the trains. They would have the best view, the fresh air, the feeling of flight. It will be a sort of breathing place, he had written, for the inhabitants of the hot and crowded city. Flanking this promenade were the tracks for the cable cars that would shuttle commuters back and forth, and on the outer edges were the lanes for horse-drawn carriages and livestock. The approach ramps were completed, massive masonry structures that cut through the existing fabric of the cities. In New York, buildings were demolished to make way for the bridge's landing, a preview of the urban renewal that would reshape the city in the next century. The bridge was no longer just an idea or a construction site. It was a physical reality that linked two land masses that had been separated since the last ice age. The tension in the cities was palpable. After 14 years of blasting, digging, spinning, and dying, the Great Bridge was done. The date was set for the opening, May 24, 1883. It was to be a celebration unlike anything New York had ever seen. The President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, was coming. The Governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, would be there. The fleets of the Navy would anchor in the harbor. But beneath the excitement, there was a current of unease. The bridge was unprecedented. It was a leap of faith. People looked at the slender cables and the massive span and wondered, could it really hold? The memory of the Tay Bridge disaster in Scotland, where a train had plunged into the sea just a few years earlier, was fresh in the public mind. The Brooklyn Bridge was beautiful, yes, but it was also a defiance of nature. On the morning of the opening, the sun rose over a city draped in bunting. Red, white, and blue flags snapped from every window, every shipmast, every lamp post. The mood was electric. Crowds began to gather at dawn, pressing against the police barricades. In Brooklyn, the schools were closed and businesses shuttered. It was a people's day. But amidst the fanfare, the man who had built it remained in his room. Washington Roebling watched the procession through his telescope. He saw the president and the governor walk across the span, the first official crossing. He saw the cannon smoke puff from the naval ships, the sound reaching him seconds later as a dull thud against the glass. He saw the stream of humanity flowing over the river, a river of life flowing over a river of water. Later that day, the dignitaries came to his house. They crowded into his parlor to shake the hand of the invalid engineer. He received them sitting down, pale and exhausted, but triumphant. Yet the true climax of the story was not the opening day speeches. It was what happened a week later, a tragedy that proved just how fragile the public's trust in this new monster of steel really was. It was a day that would stain the bridge's history with blood once more, a grim reminder of the fear that lurked beneath the awe. It happened on Decoration Day, May 30th, 1883. The holiday had brought thousands of people to the bridge. The promenade was packed shoulder to shoulder, a dense river of pedestrians enjoying the view. The air was festive, but the crowd was tight, and the narrow staircases at the approaches created bottlenecks. At the top of the flight of stairs on the New York side, a woman walking down the steps tripped. It was a simple stumble, the kind that happens every day. But in the crush of the crowd, another woman screamed. That single scream was the spark in the powder keg. The nerves of the public, taut with the subconscious fear of the bridge's collapse, snapped. Someone shouted that the bridge was falling. The rumor rippled through the crowd with the speed of a shockwave. The bridge is giving way. The cables are snapping. Panic
raw and primal, seized the thousands on the promenade. They did not look to see if the bridge was actually moving. They simply ran. But there was nowhere to run. The crowd surged forward, pressing bodies against the iron railings, trampling those who had fallen. In seconds, the breathing place became a crushing machine. Men, women, and children were piled upon one another at the foot of the stairs, a tangled mass of limbs and terrified faces. The police struggled to beat back the mob, but the weight of humanity was too great.
The panic on the staircase lasted only a few minutes, but the devastation was absolute. When the police finally managed to clear the crush, pulling the living from the dead, the scene resembled a battlefield. 12 people lay dead on the wooden planks and stone steps. Dozens more were severely injured, their bones broken by the sheer pressure of the terrified mob. Hats, parasols, shoes, and torn pieces of clothing were scattered everywhere, debris left in the wake of a phantom disaster. The tragedy was compounded by the bitter irony that the bridge itself had not failed. It had not swayed, it had not groaned, and not a single cable had snapped. The structure had stood as immovable as a mountain, while the people upon it destroyed themselves out of fear. The Great Bridge, celebrated just a week earlier as a triumph of reason and science, was now stained with the blood of the superstitious and the panicked. A pall of gloom settled over the cities. The bridge, which was supposed to be the artery of a new life, was now viewed with suspicion. Commuters were wary. If a woman tripping on a stair could trigger a massacre, was the bridge truly safe? The psychological scars ran deep. The ferry operators, who had lost business to the bridge, quietly stoked the fears, whispering that the span was too long, the wires too thin. The bridge needed a redemption, a gesture that spoke to the primal brain of the public, something that proved its solidity beyond charts and equations. That redemption came from the master of spectacle himself, P.T. Barnum. The famous showman had actually offered to march his elephants across the bridge before it opened, seeking publicity, but the trustees had turned him down. Now, in the wake of the disaster, the idea seemed less like a stunt and more like a public service. It was a known folk belief that elephants, with their immense weight and sensitive feet, would never set foot on an unsound structure. If the largest land animals on Earth felt safe crossing the East River, surely the people of Brooklyn could too. On the evening of May 17, 1884, nearly a year after the panic, the strange procession arrived. At the head of the line was Jumbo, the massive African elephant who was the crown jewel of Barnum's circus. Behind him lumbered 20 other elephants, trunk to tail, followed by 7 camels and 10 dromedaries. It was a surreal sight. The gray giants marched solemnly up the approach ramp, their heavy footfalls thudding rhythmically against the timber decking. The bridge accepted the weight without a shudder. The procession crossed from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and as Jumbo's massive silhouette moved against the twilight sky, framed by the spiderweb of steel cables, the public's fear began to evaporate. If the bridge could hold a herd of elephants, it could hold the morning rush hour. Barnum got his publicity, but the bridge got its soul back. With the fear subsiding, the bridge began to change the very nature of the city. Before the bridge, Brooklyn and New York were rivals, culturally and economically distinct. Brooklyn was a city of churches, of expansive Victorian homes, a retreat from the frantic energy of Manhattan. New York was the city of commerce, of tenements, of the rising skyscrapers. The bridge acted as a funnel, pouring the population of one into the other.
It made the concept of the commuter a mass phenomenon. Every morning, an army of workers streamed across the promenade and the rail lines, working in the towers of Wall Street and returning to the quiet streets of Brooklyn Heights at night. The toll for this convenience was initially set at a penny for a pedestrian, 5 cents for a rider on the cable car, and 10 cents for a horse and wagon. Cattle and sheep were also driven across, often in the pre-dawn hours to avoid the crowds, their hooves clattering on the wood, destined for the slaughterhouses of Manhattan. For a brief period, the bridge was a rural road suspended in the sky, mixing livestock with high society. But the toll for pedestrians was deeply unpopular. It was seen as a tax on the poor, the working class who had built the bridge and now had to pay to walk to work. After years of public pressure, the pedestrian toll was abolished in 1891, making the promenade truly free to all, a democratic park in the clouds. However, as the bridge wove itself into the daily life of the city, it also became a magnet for the desperate and the fame-hungry. The height of the roadway, 135 feet above the water at high tide, proved to be an irresistible lure. The first suicide occurred not long after opening, establishing a grim precedent. But there were also those who looked at the water below and saw not death, but a stage. The late 19th century was an era of daredevils, of men and women who sought to conquer nature through feats of endurance and risk. Enter Steve Brodie. Brodie was a bookmaker and saloon keeper from the Lower East Side, a man with a thirst for fame that far exceeded his athletic ability. He saw the bridge as his ticket to immortality. In July 1886, Brodie claimed to have jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge and survived. The story goes that he leapt from the roadway, plummeted the terrifying distance, hit the water feet first, and was fished out by a passing barge, bruised but alive. The news sensation was immediate. "Brodie jumped," screamed the headlines. He became an instant celebrity. He opened a new saloon, decorated with oil paintings of his jump, and entertained tourists for years with the tale.
But did he actually do it? Historians and contemporaries were skeptical. Many believed that Brodie had an accomplice drop a dummy from the bridge while he swam out from under a pier, waiting to be rescued by the barge. The physics of a fall from that height are unforgiving. Hitting the water at that speed is akin to hitting concrete. While people have survived the fall, it is rare and usually results in catastrophic injury. Brodie, however, emerged remarkably unscathed. Real or fake, the stunt cemented the bridge's place in American folklore. It became a cultural touchstone, a place where legends were made, a symbol of the impossible being conquered, whether by engineering genius or by a grifter's hustle. As the years ground on, the bridge began to age. The gleaming granite of the towers was slowly coated in the soot of coal-burning tugboats and the exhaust of the city. The wooden roadway, subjected to the pounding of millions of hooves and steel wheels, required constant maintenance. A permanent crew of painters and carpenters was established, men who spent their entire working lives on the bridge. They were the bridge walkers, patrolling the catwalks and the cables, checking for rust, tightening bolts, replacing rotted planks. They worked in a world apart, suspended between the city and the sky, intimately familiar with every rivet and wire. They knew the bridge's moods. They knew that in the winter the cables contracted, lifting the roadway higher above the river. In the summer heat, the steel expanded and the bridge sagged lower. It was a living, breathing organism, responding to the temperature and the load.
They also knew the sounds, the song of the bridge. When the wind blew through the diagonal stays, it created a harmonic hum, a mournful Aeolian harp that could be heard by those walking the promenade late at night. When a heavy train rumbled across, the structure would vibrate with a low, growling resonance that traveled up through the soles of one's feet. The political landscape changed as well. In 1898, the inevitable happened. The city of Brooklyn was consolidated into Greater New York. The bridge, which had physically joined them, had made the political union unavoidable. Many in Brooklyn mourned the loss of their city's independence, calling it the Great Mistake, but the tide of history was unstoppable. The bridge was no longer a link between two cities. It was now the internal spine of a single sprawling metropolis. But as the 20th century dawned, the Brooklyn Bridge faced a new threat, one that John Roebling never anticipated: the automobile. The bridge had been designed for carriages, cable cars, and pedestrians. It was not built for the internal combustion engine. As cars and heavy trucks began to proliferate, the load on the bridge changed. The erratic stop-and-go traffic of automobiles created different stresses than the rhythmic trotting of horses or the smooth gliding of cable cars. The wooden roadway became slick with oil. The narrow lanes, adequate for buggies, were tight for Model Ts and delivery trucks. By the 1940s, the bridge was showing its age. The intricate system of trains and cable cars that Roebling had integrated was becoming obsolete. The city planners, led by the polarizing figure of Robert Moses, looked at the bridge and saw a bottleneck. Moses, who favored highways and speed over history and aesthetics, wanted to modernize the bridge. In a massive renovation starting in 1944 and continuing into the 50s, the train tracks were removed. The elegant, sheltered terminals were dismantled. The bridge was reconfigured to carry 6 lanes of automobile traffic. In this process, much of the Victorian charm was stripped away. The iron trusses were strengthened. The roadway was paved over with concrete and asphalt, covering the timber that had rumbled under the feet of Jumbo. The breathing place remained. The elevated promenade was saved, largely because it was structurally integral to the bridge's stability. It covered the central stiffening trusses. If not for that engineering necessity, one wonders if Moses would have scrapped the walkway entirely to squeeze in another lane for cars. Despite the modernization, the soul of the bridge remained in the stone and the steel. It stood watch as the skyline of Manhattan transformed. It saw the rise of the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building. It watched the Twin Towers grow, dominate the view, and then tragically fall. Through blackouts, hurricanes, and terrorist attacks, the bridge remained a constant. During the blackout of 2003, and again on 9/11, when the subways stopped and the tunnels closed, the bridge reverted to its original purpose, a lifeline. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, covered in dust or plunged in darkness, walked across the wooden planks of the promenade to get home, just as their ancestors had done in 1883. But to truly understand the bridge, one must look closer, beyond the grand history, at the materials themselves. The caissons, those massive wooden boxes where John Roebling ruined his health, are still there, buried deep in the mud of the East River. They are the invisible feet of the giant. The wood, sealed in the airtight, oxygen-free environment of the riverbed, has not rotted. It is as hard as stone today as it was in 1870. The entire weight of the granite towers, the steel cables, the concrete roadway, and the millions of cars that cross every year rests upon that yellow pine timber cut from the forests of Georgia over a century and a half ago. And then there is the wire. If you were to take apart the four main cables and lay the individual wires end to end, they would stretch for over 14,000 miles, more than halfway around the Earth. This wire, galvanized to resist the salt air, has fought a silent war against erosion for 140 years. The Roeblings knew that rust was the ultimate enemy. They designed the cables to be wrapped tightly with soft wire, creating a seal, and then painted. But water is patient. It finds the microscopic cracks.
Deep within the massive masonry approaches of the Brooklyn Bridge, beneath the ramps where modern tourists snap selfies and cyclists ring their bells, lies a dark, labyrinthine world that remained frozen in time for decades. The bridge is not solid stone. The anchorages are honeycombed with vast vaulted chambers. These cavernous spaces, with their soaring brick arches, were originally designed by John Roebling for a practical, commercial purpose. He intended them to be rented out as storage warehouses. The logic was sound. The cool, dark, consistent temperature inside the thick granite walls was perfect for storing wine and champagne. For years, the famous liquor merchants Luty's brothers stored their finest vintages in the vaults under the Manhattan approach, paying the bridge authority a handsome rent. The scent of aging oak and fermented grapes once mingled with the salt air of the river. But as the decades passed and refrigeration became common, the wine cellars were abandoned, their heavy iron doors locked and forgotten. The chambers sat in silence, gathering dust, known only to the rats and the few maintenance workers who held the keys. It wasn't until 2006, during a routine structural inspection, that city workers stumbled upon a secret room inside the masonry of the Manhattan anchorage, a discovery that abruptly brought the Cold War rushing back into the 21st century. Breaking through a sealed wall, they found a windowless room piled high with cardboard boxes, metal drums, and medical supplies. It was a fallout shelter, stockpiled at the height of the nuclear panic in the 1950s, and then utterly forgotten. The supplies were covered in a thick blanket of gray dust, undisturbed for half a century. There were hundreds of rusted metal drums labeled "for use only after enemy attack," filled with drinking water that had long since gone stale. There were boxes of civil defense all-purpose survival crackers, their wax paper wrappings yellowed and brittle. There were medical kits containing bandages and primitive sedatives, blankets meant to warm the survivors of an atomic winter, and paper shock instruction pamphlets. The discovery was a haunting time capsule. It spoke of a time when the bridge was seen not just as a thoroughfare, but as a fortress, a place where the government believed people might cower while the world burned. The silence of that room, hidden inside one of the busiest structures on Earth, was profound. It was a grim reminder that the bridge, built to conquer the river, was also conscripted to conquer the fear of extinction. The supplies were eventually removed, but the empty chamber remains, a ghost room in the belly of the beast. High above these dark crypts, another secret life flourishes, one that belongs to the wind and the sky. The Brooklyn Bridge has become an artificial cliff face, a substitute for the mountains that do not exist in New York City. For decades, peregrine falcons, the fastest animals on the planet, have made the towers their home. These raptors, which were nearly driven to extinction by DDT in the mid-20th century, found a sanctuary in the Gothic arches of the Roebling Towers. To a falcon, the bridge is the perfect hunting ground.
The height provides a commanding view of the river and the city, allowing them to spot pigeons and seagulls from miles away. Bird watchers and bridge painters often see them, dark, arrow-like shapes diving at 200 miles per hour, striking their prey in mid-air with an explosion of feathers. The maintenance crews have learned to give the nesting sites a wide berth. A mother falcon protecting her eyrie is fearless and will dive-bomb a construction worker in a hard hat with the same aggression she shows a rival hawk. In the midst of the steel and concrete metropolis, the bridge supports a raw, violent ecosystem, a return to the wild that John Roebling, with his philosophical love of nature, might have appreciated. To fully understand the soul of the bridge, however, one must leave New York and travel south to the place where its sinews were forged. The story of the Brooklyn Bridge is inextricably linked to the story of Trenton, New Jersey, and the company town of Roebling. After John Roebling's death and Washington's incapacitation, the family business, John A. Roebling's Sons Company, continued to grow. It became the premier wire rope manufacturer in the world, a titan of industry that supplied the cables for the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the elevator cables that allowed the skyscrapers of Manhattan to rise. The Roebling Steel Mill in Trenton was a place of fire, smoke, and deafening noise. It was a sprawling complex of red brick buildings where thousands of immigrants, Hungarians, Poles, Italians, labored in the heat of the blast furnaces. The process of making the wire for the Brooklyn Bridge was a testament to the brutal, beautiful efficiency of the industrial age. It began with the blooms, massive ingots of steel that were heated until they glowed white-hot. These blooms were passed through a series of rollers, squeezed thinner and thinner, lengthening into rods. The rods were then subjected to the drawing process. This was the heart of the Roebling magic. The cold steel rods were pulled forcibly through a die, a hole slightly larger than the rod itself. This required immense power. As the steel was dragged through the die, the grains of the metal were elongated and aligned, increasing the tensile strength. The rod became a wire. But it wasn't done. It was heated again, quenched in oil, and drawn again through an even smaller die. This happened repeatedly, a process of tempering and reducing, until the wire achieved the perfect balance of flexibility and strength. The men who worked the wire mills lived lives that were hard and dangerous. A snapping wire could whip through the air like a razor, severing a limb. The heat from the furnaces was enough to singe hair and eyebrows. To keep his workforce stable and loyal, the Roebling family built an entire town, simply named Roebling, on the banks of the Delaware River. It was a paternalistic utopia, or perhaps a benevolent cage. The company built the houses, the school, the library, the bank, and the general store. The streets were wide and lined with trees. The rent was cheap. In exchange, the workers gave their lives to the wire.
The town was designed with the same precision as a suspension bridge. The hierarchy of the factory was mirrored in the architecture of the village. The unskilled laborers lived in row houses near the river. The foremen lived in larger, semi-detached houses further up the hill. The managers lived in spacious single-family homes on the main boulevard. And watching over it all was the statue of John A. Roebling. In this town, the dust of the wire mill settled on everything. The laundry hung out to dry would catch the soot. The children played with scrap metal. The rhythm of the town was the rhythm of the shift whistle. It was from this intense, focused industrial crucible that the wires of the Brooklyn Bridge emerged. Every strand of the main cables, every suspender rope was the product of sweat,
poured out in New Jersey. The bridge is, in a very real sense, a monument to that labor. When you touch the cables today, you are touching the handiwork of men who lived and died in the shadow of the Roebling mills, men whose names are not on the bronze plaques, but whose strength holds the roadway in the sky. The maintenance of this strength is a never-ending battle against the elements. The most persistent enemy is rust. The bridge is situated in a saltwater estuary, a corrosive environment that eats steel. To combat this, the bridge must be painted. Painting the Brooklyn Bridge is not a project that has a beginning and an end. It is a continuous cycle. It is said that once the painters finish the bridge, it is time to go back to the beginning and start again. In the old days, the painting was done by men who were part sailor, part acrobat. They mixed their own paint, red lead and linseed oil, a heavy, toxic sludge that protected the steel but poisoned the painters. They climbed the cables without safety lines, carrying heavy buckets, slathering the red paste onto the wires. Their clothes were permanently stained orange. They breathed the lead dust. They ate their sandwiches with lead-covered hands. Today, we know the grim toll of lead poisoning, but then it was just the smell of the job. The color of the bridge has been a subject of debate for historians. We see it today in its Brooklyn Bridge tan or Roebling gray, but forensic analysis of paint chips suggests it has worn many coats. There was Rawlins red, a deep oxide red. There was a period where it might have been buff or yellow. The current color is a carefully chosen beige intended to replicate the look of the limestone towers, unifying the steel and stone visually. But beneath those layers of modern, environmentally safe paint, the old lead primer is still there, encapsulating the steel, a toxic shield that must never be disturbed without hazmat suits and containment tents. One of the most tedious and boring tasks of the bridge's upkeep involves the inspection of the anchor pins. These are massive steel cylinders buried deep in the anchorages that hold the ends of the cables. If these pins were to rust through and shear, the cables would fly loose and the bridge would collapse. Because they are located in damp, dark chambers, they are prone to corrosion. For decades, inspectors had to crawl into tight, claustrophobic spaces, chipping away concrete to get a look at the pins. In recent years, modern technology has tried to aid this process. Engineers have installed acoustic monitoring sensors on the bridge. These are microphones that listen to the steel. They are tuned to hear the specific frequency of a wire snapping. If a single wire inside the main cable breaks, a ping that sounds like a gunshot in the silence of the cable, the sensor records it and triangulates the location. This allows engineers to know if the bridge is deteriorating from the inside out. The bridge is constantly talking, broadcasting its health in a language of vibrations and frequencies that only the computers can understand. There is also the matter of the temperature. The bridge is a thermometer. The main span of the bridge rises and falls by over a foot between winter and summer. John Roebling accounted for this. At the towers, the trusses are not bolted down. They sit on saddles, massive rollers that allow the cables to slide back and forth as they expand and contract. If you stand at the expansion joints on the roadway on a hot day, you can actually see the bridge moving, a slow metallic breathing that accommodates the sun. It is a reminder that the structure is dynamic, not static. It is a machine that is constantly adjusting itself to the world around it. As we move deeper into the 20th and 21st centuries in our narrative, we must acknowledge the underneath of the bridge, the park that grew in its shadow. For decades, the area under the Brooklyn approach was a gritty industrial waterfront, a place of warehouses and piers, shadowed and often dangerous. It was the setting for noir films and crime novels. But the transformation of Brooklyn Bridge Park has turned this post-industrial wasteland into a lush green space. This, too, is part of the bridge's story, its ability to generate value and beauty around it. However, the park construction revealed more of the bridge's buried history. Excavators found the remnants of the old ferry slips, the rotting pilings of the docks where John Roebling's foot was crushed. They found shards of pottery, clay pipes, and old coins dropped by the millions of commuters who took the boats before the bridge rendered them obsolete. The ground beneath the bridge is a layered archaeological site, a lasagna of New York history. One of the most curious, boring facts about the bridge concerns its legal status. Is it a street, a building, a national monument? Technically, for many years, the bridge was owned by a private company, the New York Bridge Company. It was a toll road. It wasn't until later that the city took full ownership. This led to strange legal loopholes. In the early days, because it was privately held, the bridge police were effectively private security guards with the power of arrest. The bridge police were a distinct force, separate from the NYPD, with their own uniforms and their own precinct housed inside the archways of the bridge itself. They dealt with the pickpockets who worked the crowds, the suicides, and the drunks. It wasn't until the 1990s that the bridge police were fully merged into the NYPD, ending a century of a separate jurisdiction floating above the river. To comprehend the sheer immovability of the Brooklyn Bridge, one must look far beyond the East River, to the rugged, storm-battered coast of Maine. The granite that forms the two Gothic towers, those twin sentinels that have watched over the harbor for nearly a century and a half, was not born in New York. It was torn from the earth of Vinyl Haven and Hurricane Island, isolated outposts of rock in the Atlantic Ocean. The Bodwell Granite Company, situated on these islands, was the source of the stone. This was not a delicate operation of artistry. It was a brutal war against geology. The granite from these islands was chosen for its specific crystalline structure, a dense gray matrix of quartz and feldspar that was virtually impervious to weathering. In the 1870s, the quarrymen of Maine were a distinct breed, often Scottish or Italian immigrants who had brought the secrets of stone cutting from the Old World. They worked in open pits, exposed to the biting salt winds, using steam drills and black powder to cleave massive blocks from the bedrock. The sound of the quarries was a rhythmic metallic clinking of hammers on chisels, a sound that rang out across the water from dawn until dusk. The danger here was different from the bends of the Caissons, but just as lethal. A slipped chain could crush a man in an instant. The stone dust, fine and sharp as glass, settled in the lungs, leading to the stone cutter's consumption, or silicosis, a slow suffocation that claimed many before they reached old age. Once the blocks were cut, some weighing as much as 8 tons, they were loaded onto schooners, the heavy-hauling sailing ships of the day. These ships had to navigate the treacherous Atlantic coast, risking gales and shoals to deliver their heavy cargo to the Brooklyn and New York wharves. Several schooners were lost to the sea, dragging their granite burden to the bottom of the ocean, where it sits today, a sunken foundation that never reached the river. When the stone finally arrived at the construction site, it was hoisted by steam derricks that chuffed and smoked, stacking the blocks with a precision that belies their weight. If you look closely at the towers today, you can still see the distinct differences in the stone. The limestone used for the decorative cornices and the upper portions came from Kingston, New York, and has weathered differently than the main granite, creating a subtle patchwork of grays and buffs that reveals the geological sourcing of the monument. The towers are not monolithic. They are a jigsaw puzzle of thousands of individual blocks, each one cut by hand, each one holding the sweat of a man in Maine or upstate New York. It was this massive accumulation of stone that faced its greatest natural test just 5 years after the bridge opened. The Great Blizzard of 1888 is legendary in New York history, a white hurricane that paralyzed the eastern seaboard. Snow fell for a day and a half, whipped by winds of 85 miles per hour. The city was buried. The elevated trains in Manhattan froze on the tracks, the steam engines useless against the drifts. The horse-drawn streetcars were abandoned in the streets, turning into white mounds. And once again, the East River froze. The ferries, which had been the primary argument against the bridge's necessity, were rendered helpless. They sat locked in the ice, their paddle wheels churned uselessly. The city was cut in two, but the bridge was open. For the first time, the true strategic value of John Roebling's dream was undeniable. It was the only link. Thousands of people, desperate to get home or to reach trapped family members, wrapped themselves in wool and furs and began the trek across the promenade. The scene on the bridge during the blizzard was apocalyptic. The wind at that height was strong enough to knock a grown man down. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, stinging the skin like sand. Pedestrians formed human chains, holding on to each other's coats and the iron railings, heads bowed against the gale. The bridge itself was a ghost in the storm, the cables whistling a high-pitched shriek, the towers appearing and disappearing in the whiteout. Yet the bridge did not sway. The diagonal stays, those web-like cables that Roebling had insisted upon, held the deck rigid against the hurricane-force gusts. While telephone poles snapped and roofs were torn off across the city, the great bridge simply endured. It was the moment the bridge ceased to be a novelty and became a savior. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the bridge began to host a new kind of traffic, the mass transit of the industrial age. We often think of the bridge today as a car bridge, but for much of its life it was a train bridge. In 1898, the trolley lines of Brooklyn were connected to the bridge, allowing streetcars to loop across. Then came the elevated trains, the heavy rapid transit that connected to the Brooklyn L system. The bridge was carrying 4 tracks of rail traffic, 2 for trolleys, 2 for elevated trains. The noise was deafening. Writers of the era complained that conversation on the bridge was impossible. The steel wheels on steel rails, grinding and screeching, reverberated through the entire structure. This vibration was a constant assault on the materials. The iron pins and bolts were subjected to millions of cycles of stress. It was found that the trains were causing the bridge to twist slightly, an asymmetrical load that Roebling hadn't fully anticipated, as trains were heavier and faster than he had imagined. This led to a series of urgent retrofits in the early 1900s to strengthen the trusses and stiffen the deck. The congestion at the terminals was a nightmare. The Brooklyn terminal was a chaotic hive of thousands of people transferring from streetcars to the bridge trains. It was a place of pickpockets, newsboys shouting headlines, and the constant crushing press of bodies. The rush hour crush became known as the bridge crush, a daily ordeal that New Yorkers endured with gritty resignation. It was here that the pusher became a profession, men hired by the transit companies to physically shove passengers into the crowded train cars so the doors could close. Amid this industrial chaos, there were moments of strange, quiet tragedy. The bridge became a focal point for the forgotten people of the city. In the early 20th century, police began to find people living inside the bridge. The massive arched approaches, with their hidden nooks and utility spaces, became makeshift homes for the homeless. They would curl up in the ventilation shafts or break into the storage vaults, creating small, dark domestic worlds beneath the feet of the commuters. They were the trolls of the bridge, living on the scraps of the city, sheltered by the granite of the Roeblings.
One of the most bizarre incidents involved a man named John Paulson, a wire walker fanatic who in 1923 climbed one of the main cables late at night, not to jump, but to sleep. He was found the next morning curled up in the saddle at the very top of the Manhattan Tower, hundreds of feet above the river. When police talked him down, he claimed it was the only place in the city where it was quiet enough to dream. The bridge also attracted the scientific mind. In the 1930s, physicists used the bridge to test theories of thermal expansion and resonance. They measured how the bridge sang in the wind. They found that the bridge had a natural frequency, a specific pitch at which it wanted to vibrate. If the wind blew at a speed that matched this frequency, the bridge could theoretically destroy itself, a phenomenon known as aeroelastic flutter. This is what destroyed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. But Roebling, through intuition and his redundant system of stays, had dampened this frequency. He had confused the wind. The crisscrossing cables broke up the airflow, preventing the rhythmic amplification that leads to collapse. It was an accidental triumph of aerodynamics before aerodynamics was fully understood. However, the bridge was not immune to the ravages of chemistry. By the mid-20th century, a new enemy had appeared: road salt. As automobiles took over and the tracks were paved, the city began using salt to melt ice in the winter. This salt water, mixed with oil and grime, seeped into the concrete roadway. It migrated down to the steel floor beams and the truss work. Salt is the nemesis of steel. It accelerates oxidation, causing the metal to flake and crumble. By the 1980s, the Brooklyn Bridge was in a state of quiet crisis. The diagonal stay cables, those critical elements that kept the bridge stiff, were fraying. The salt had eaten away the connections. In a shocking report, engineers revealed that some of the cables could potentially snap under heavy load. The grim reality was that the bridge, a symbol of eternal strength, was rotting from the inside. A massive rehabilitation project was launched, one of the most complex engineering feats since the initial construction. This wasn't just a repair job, it was open-heart surgery on a marathon runner while he was still running. They could not close the bridge, it was too vital to the city's economy. So the work had to be done at night or in narrow lanes, while traffic roared inches away. The most terrifying part of this renovation was the replacement of the diagonal stays. To replace a cable that is under tension, holding up a bridge, you cannot just cut it. If you cut a taut cable, it snaps with the force of a cannonball, destroying everything in its path. The engineers had to design a system to transfer the load. They built temporary brackets and used hydraulic jacks to pull the bridge deck up, relieving the tension on the old cable just enough to unpin it. Then they would install the new cable and slowly release the jacks, letting the weight settle onto the fresh steel. They did this hundreds of times, cable by cable, night after night.
It was a high-stakes game of tension and release played out over the dark waters of the East River. During this era, the bridge also revealed more of its grim secrets. In the course of cleaning the stone towers, workers discovered peculiar discolorations. It was determined that these were not just dirt, but the accumulated soot of a century of coal burning. The bridge had acted as a filter for the city's air. When they steam cleaned the granite, the water that ran off was black as ink, a liquid history of New York's pollution. The cleaning also disturbed the bridge's residents, the bats. For years, colonies of bats had roosted in the dark crevices under the roadway and in the expansion joints. They were the natural pest control of the bridge, feeding on the clouds of gnats and moths that gathered around the bridge lights. The renovation work displaced them, and for a few summers, residents in Brooklyn Heights reported a surge in insect populations, a small ecological ripple effect of the bridge's maintenance. There is also the story of the locksmiths of love, a modern phenomenon that became a plague. In the 2000s, tourists began fastening padlocks to the bridge's mesh wiring as a symbol of eternal love, throwing the keys into the river. It seemed a romantic gesture, but to the engineers it was a structural hazard. A single rock weighs a few ounces, but tens of thousands of locks add thousands of pounds of dead weight to the structure. Furthermore, the locks caused the wire mesh to rust. The city had to deploy crews with bolt cutters to wage a constant war against these metallic parasites. In 1 year alone, they removed over 11,000 locks. It was a strange conflict, the human desire for symbolic permanence clashing with the engineering reality of weight limits. But perhaps the most boring yet critical aspect of the bridge's modern life is the inspection of the main cable wrapping. The main cables are not exposed steel. They are wrapped in soft iron wire, like a mummy. This wrapping is painted and sealed. To inspect the actual load-bearing wires inside, engineers must carefully unwrap a section, drive in plastic wedges to separate the thousands of wires, and pour in linseed oil. Then they look for broken wires. A few broken wires are acceptable, a redundancy built in by Roebling. But if they find a cluster of breaks, it signals a weak spot. In a recent inspection, they found that the interior of the cables, sealed in 1883, was in remarkably good condition. The wires were still greasy from the original manufacturing process. The air inside the cable was dry. Roebling's insistence on the highest quality of wrapping had created a time capsule of steel. The wires that Washington Roebling had watched being spun from his sickbed were still carrying the load, straight and true, 140 years later. Yet the bridge is not silent about its age. It groans. If you stand on the pedestrian walkway during a quiet moment, which is rare, you can hear the clank-clank of the expansion plates. You can feel the deck tremble as a heavy truck hits a pothole. These are the sounds of an old man, arthritic but strong. The bridge requires constant care. It is never finished. There is always a scaffold somewhere, always a tarp fluttering in the wind. It is a permanent construction site, disguised as a monument.
The bridge, in its stoic silence, has not only battled the elements, but has also served as a silent witness to the darker currents of human conflict. As World War I engulfed Europe, the Brooklyn Bridge ceased to be merely a municipal thoroughfare and became a strategic asset of the highest order and a target. In 1915, paranoia gripped the city. Rumors swirled of German saboteurs, phantom agents lurking in the shadows with satchels of dynamite, intent on severing the arteries of American commerce. The idea was not entirely unfounded. German agents had already targeted other infrastructure in North America.
The bridge, with its exposed cables and symbolic weight, was the ultimate prize for any agent of chaos. For the first time since its construction, the bridge was placed under armed guard. Soldiers with bayonets fixed to their rifles patrolled the promenade day and night. Searchlights were installed on the towers, their harsh white beams sweeping the dark waters of the East River, hunting for submarines or small boats approaching the pilings. The pedestrian experience changed. The casual stroll became a walk through a militarized zone. Commuters were stopped and their packages inspected. The bridge, which Roebling had envisioned as a unifier, became a fortress, a grim reminder that the oceans could no longer protect the New World from the wars of the Old. This fear resurfaced with even greater intensity during World War II. The lights of the bridge, the beautiful necklace of pearls that defined the night skyline, were extinguished. For years, the bridge stood in total darkness, a black shape against a black sky, compliant with the rigorous blackout regulations designed to protect New York from U-boat shelling or Luftwaffe bombers that never came. The only light was the dim, hooded glow of automobile headlights creeping across the span. To the captains of the troop ships leaving the Brooklyn Navy Yard, passing under the darkened bridge was the final farewell to America, a passage from the safety of the harbor into the wolf-infested Atlantic. But the most persistent war fought on the bridge was not against foreign powers, but against the despair of its own citizens. The grim reality of the Brooklyn Bridge includes a chapter that is often whispered but rarely detailed: its magnetism for the lost. Since the day it opened, the bridge has exerted a dark gravitational pull on the suicidal. The height is deceptive. From the promenade, the water looks calm, almost inviting, but the impact is unforgiving. In the 1920s and 30s, during the crushing poverty of the Great Depression, the numbers spiked. The bridge became a barometer of the city's misery. To combat this, the New York Police Department had to evolve. They created what was informally known as the Suicide Squad, a subset of the Emergency Service Unit, ESU. These officers were, and still are, part psychologist, part mountaineer. Their jurisdiction is the thin steel beam and the trembling wire. When a jumper climbs out onto the unauthorized areas of the structure, often scaling the suspension cables to sit hundreds of feet above the water, the ESU officers must follow. The physical danger of a rescue on the Brooklyn Bridge is unique. The main cables are slippery, coated in the grease and grime of the city. In the winter, they are sheathed in ice. The officers wear harnesses, but often, to establish a rapport with the distressed individual, they must approach slowly, calmly, sometimes removing their heavy gear to appear less threatening. There are accounts of officers spending hours perched on a cold steel saddle 27 stories above the river, talking to a person who has lost everything. They talk about the weather, about sports, about anything to break the trance of despair. It is a quiet, high-stakes negotiation played out in the wind, unnoticed by the millions of commuters passing below. There was one particularly harrowing incident in the late 1970s, a decade when New York City was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and social collapse. The bridge, reflecting the city's condition, was covered in graffiti, its lights broken, its roadway potholed. A man climbed to the very top of the Manhattan Tower, not to jump, but to protest. He had a banner and a megaphone. The wind was so fierce that the police helicopter could not get close. ESU officers had to climb the cables by hand, dragging ropes and safety nets. The standoff lasted all day, causing a traffic jam that paralyzed Lower Manhattan. It was a chaotic tableau of a city in crisis, the crumbling infrastructure, the angry gridlock, and the lone figure screaming into the void. The 1970s and 80s were indeed the bridge's dark ages. Maintenance budgets were slashed. The bridge began to shed its skin. Chunks of concrete, loosened by the freeze-thaw cycle and the vibration of traffic, began to fall from the underside of the roadway and the approaches. These weren't pebbles, they were jagged pieces of masonry the size of footballs. The area under the bridge became a hard hat zone. Nets were strung up under the arches to catch the falling debris, a band-aid on a gaping wound. One of the most tragic casualties of this neglect was a pedestrian named Toshio Nishimura. In 1981, he was walking on the promenade taking photographs when a diagonal stay cable, one of the vital steel ropes that give the bridge its web-like appearance, snapped. The cable, corroded by years of salt and rust, whipped through the air with the force of a scythe. It struck Nishimura, killing him instantly. This was the wake-up call the city needed. It proved that the factor of safety Washington Roebling had built in was being eroded by a century of apathy. The bridge was not immortal, it was dying. This incident triggered a forensic investigation into every inch of the bridge. Engineers found that the corrosion was far worse than imagined. The eyes, the steel loops where the cables attached to the anchorages, were thinning dangerously. The decision was made to embark on a massive, decades-long rehabilitation that continues in various phases to this day. It was during this period that the bridge was wrapped in what looked like bandages, protective tarps, and scaffolding that hid the towers for years. But amidst the decay, life persisted in the most unexpected places. In the vaulted arches under the Manhattan approach, famously known as the Brooklyn Banks, a subculture flourished. This area, a sloping brick expanse, originally designed for drainage and structural support, became a mecca for skateboarders. In the 1980s and 90s, the banks were legendary. The steep brick transitions were perfect for skating, and the overhead shelter of the bridge meant one could skate in the rain. It was a gritty, unregulated playground, filled with graffiti, broken glass, and the clatter of urethane wheels. To the city, it was a nuisance and a liability. To the skaters, it was sacred ground. The bridge was inadvertently nurturing the birth of modern street skateboarding. The banks were featured in magazines and video games, making the dark underbelly of the Brooklyn Bridge famous globally, even if the tourists walking 100 feet above had no idea it existed. Eventually, the city reclaimed the space for storage and construction staging, closing the banks and fencing them off, erasing a chapter of the bridge's social history. There is also the matter of the sandhogs, the urban miners of New York. While the bridge is a creature of the air, its neighbors are creatures of the earth. In the early 1900s, as the subway system expanded, tunnels were dug directly under the East River, dangerously close to the bridge's pilings. The fear was that the tunneling would disturb the riverbed and destabilize the caissons. The sandhogs, working in compressed air, just like Roebling had decades earlier, had to tread lightly.
Engineers installed sensitive tilt meters on the bridge towers. If the towers moved even a fraction of an inch due to the tunneling below, the alarms would sound. It was a delicate dance of engineering, boring through the mud below while holding up the granite mountains above. The tunnels were completed successfully, but to this day, when a subway train rumbles through the Cranberry Street Tunnel deep underwater, the vibration travels through the mud, through the timber caisson, up the stone tower, and dissipates into the cables, a subtle handshake between the two great transportation systems of the city.
In the realm of maritime navigation, the Brooklyn Bridge presents a formidable psychological barrier. For the captains of the massive container ships and cruise liners, the bridge is the ceiling of the harbor. The clearance under the bridge at high tide is approximately 127 feet. Many modern ships are taller than this. They have to hinge their masts, folding them down to scrape under the span. There is a phenomenon known as squat in hydrodynamics. When a large ship moves fast in shallow water, it sinks lower. Captains will sometimes intentionally speed up their vessels to induce squat, lowering the ship by a few feet to squeeze under the bridge with inches to spare. It is a terrifying maneuver. Looking up from the bridge of a ship, the steel girders of the roadway seem to rush at you, threatening to shear off the antennas and radar towers. There have been near misses. In 2009, the Queen Mary II, one of the largest ocean liners in the world, had to wait for low tide to pass under the Verrazano Bridge, but it could never fit under the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge effectively draws a line in the water. Beyond this point, the giants cannot go. It protects the inner harbor from the leviathans of modern commerce, keeping the East River on a human scale. Let us return to the wire itself, the soul of the structure. The spinning of the cables was a miracle of 19th century labor, but the preservation of them is a miracle of 21st century chemistry. The greatest threat to the bridge is not weight, but water. Specifically, water that gets trapped inside the cable. Once water enters the tightly bundled wires, it has nowhere to go. It sits there, creating a humid microclimate that rots the steel from the inside out. To solve this, modern engineers have turned the Brooklyn Bridge into a dehumidifier. In a recent high-tech retrofit, a system was installed to pump dry air through the main cables. The system forces air into the cable at high pressure, pushing the moisture out through the wrapping. Sensors embedded deep inside the cable monitor the relative humidity. It is a life support system for the steel. If you walk past the anchorages today, you might hear the faint hum of the compressors, the artificial lungs that keep the bridge breathing dry air. Another boring but vital component of the bridge's reality are the expansion joints. These are the serrated metal teeth seen on the roadway. They interlock like fingers. As the bridge expands in the summer heat, the fingers slide together. In the winter contraction, they pull apart. Without these joints, the bridge would tear itself apart. But these joints are also the weak points for noise. Every time a car tire hits them, it makes a distinctive thwack. For the residents living in the apartments directly under the bridge approaches in Dumbo and Brooklyn Heights, this sound is the metronome of their lives. It is a rhythmic, ceaseless percussion that never stops, day or night. In the 1990s, the Brooklyn Bridge became the centerpiece of a terror plot that highlighted its symbolic vulnerability. This was the Day of Terror plot, where a group of extremists planned to cut the support cables of the Brooklyn Bridge, hoping to cause it to collapse onto the FDR drive below. The plot was foiled by the FBI, but the details were chilling. They had studied the bridge's anatomy. They knew that the suspender cables were the accessible weak points. This led to a permanent change in security architecture. Concrete barriers, surveillance cameras, and a constant police presence became the new normal. The innocent era of the bridge, when one could wander anywhere, climb the towers, or camp in the anchorages, was officially over. Yet, despite the security and the sensors, the bridge retains its mysteries. There is the mystery of the lost time capsule. It is rumored, though never confirmed, that during the laying of the cornerstone in 1870, a copper box was embedded in the stone. Inside, it is said to contain copies of the daily newspapers, coins of the era, and perhaps a copy of the Roebling clans. But the exact location of this stone was not recorded with precision, or the records were lost in a fire. It lies somewhere in the thousands of tons of granite, a secret message from the past, waiting for a future that may never find it. Then there is the sensory experience of the bridge at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. This is when the bridge is most itself. The tourists are gone. The vendors selling cheap magnets and water bottles have packed up. The traffic is thin. In this silence, you can hear the river. You can hear the slap of the water against the stone piers. You can hear the wind singing through the wire mesh, a high, mournful note. You can smell the brine and the exhaust. It is in these hours that the ghosts of the bridge seem most present. John Roebling dying in agony, Washington watching from his window, the 20 men killed in the collapse of the false work, the 12 trampled on the stairs. The bridge is a graveyard in the sky, a beautiful, melancholy monument to human ambition and human frailty. The lighting of the bridge has also evolved, shifting from the practical to the aesthetic. Originally, the bridge was lit by gas lamps, which cast a flickering yellow light. Then came the carbon arc lamps, bright and harsh. Today, the bridge is illuminated by energy-efficient LEDs that can change color. But for decades, the most distinct feature was the necklace lights, the string of bulbs tracing the curve of the main cables. Maintaining these lights is one of the most dangerous jobs in New York. The bulbs are located on the main cables, 276 feet in the air. To change a burnt-out bulb, an electrician must walk the cable. In the old days, they did this with no safety rail, just balancing on the round bundle of wires, holding the replacement bulb in a satchel. It was a high-wire act performed for the sake of a light bulb. Today, they use safety lines, but the wind and the vertigo are the same. When you see the bridge twinkling at night, remember that every single point of light was placed there by a human hand reaching out into the darkness.
Beyond the cold mechanics of steel and stone, the Brooklyn Bridge possesses a metaphysical weight that few other structures in the world can claim. It has served not just as a roadway, but as a muse, a cathedral of the industrial age that has inspired a century of art and literature. To understand the bridge's hold on the American imagination, one must look through the eyes of the artists who were obsessed with it. For them, the bridge was not a solution to a traffic problem, it was a religious icon. The modernist painter Joseph Stella, an Italian immigrant, saw the bridge as the altar of the New World. In his famous painting, The Voice of the City of New York Interpreted, the bridge is depicted in fractured crystalline shards of blue and steel, a chaotic yet harmonious web that resembles stained glass. Stella wrote that standing on the bridge gave him the same feeling as standing in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. It was the shrine of modernity. The cables were the strings of a divine harp, vibrating with the energy of the millions who crossed it. Then there was the poet Hart Crane, a man who sought to capture the soul of America in verse. In the 1920s, Crane became so fixated on the bridge that he moved into an apartment at 110 Columbia Heights in Brooklyn, the exact same address where Washington Roebling had lived and suffered during the construction. Crane wanted to see what Roebling saw. He wanted to look through the same window, to feel the ghost of the crippled engineer.
His epic poem, simply titled The Bridge, treats the structure as a mystical entity, a curve ship that lends a myth to God. For Crane, the bridge was the synthesis of the river below, chaos, nature, and the city above, order, technology. Tragically, Crane's life ended in the water, not of the East River, but the Gulf of Mexico, a suicide that echoed the dark allure of the bridge he deified. This artistic fascination extended to the photographers. Walker Evans, the great chronicler of the Depression, spent days photographing the bridge from underneath, focusing on the massive connection points where the cables met the stone. His photos revealed the brute force of the construction, the rivets, the rust, the sheer heaviness of it. He stripped away the romance and showed the boring reality of the industrial object. It was a tool, scarred and weathered, and in that utility Evans found a different kind of beauty. But the bridge's most raucous moment of glory came not from a painting, but from a party. The centennial celebration of 1983 was a pivotal moment in the history of New York City. The city was just emerging from the dark, crime-ridden days of the 1970s. It needed a win. The 100th birthday of the bridge became that win. On May 24, 1983, a parade of sheer spectacle took over the harbor. A flotilla of ships, fireboats spraying red, white, and blue water, and a procession of cars dating from every year of the bridge's existence crossed the span. The climax was the fireworks display, orchestrated by the famous Grucci family. It was, at the time, the largest pyrotechnic display in history. For 20 minutes, the sky over the East River was on fire. The bridge itself was illuminated by a sound and light show that attempted to tell the story of the Roeblings. But beneath the fanfare, the engineers held their breath. The bridge was old. The sheer weight of the crowds packed onto the promenade was testing the safety margins once again. The vibrations from the explosions and the cheering crowd were picked up by the seismographs at Fordham University in the Bronx. The bridge held, but the cleanup took days. The celebration marked the beginning of the gentrification of Brooklyn, transforming it from a working-class borough into a global brand, with the bridge as its logo.
Yet, for the pedestrian walking the bridge today, the most immediate sensory experience comes from the feet, not the eyes. The promenade of the Brooklyn Bridge is not paved with asphalt or concrete. It is made of wood. This is a deliberate engineering choice that dates back to Roebling, though the wood itself has changed. The promenade consists of thousands of wooden planks laid with gaps between them to allow rain and snow to fall through to the roadway below and, unfortunately, onto the cars. The choice of wood is critical. It is lighter than concrete, reducing the dead load on the cables. It also provides traction. But not just any wood can survive the New York climate and the trampling of 4 million tourists a year. For decades, the city used a specific timber known as greenheart, or Chlorocardium rhodii. Sourced from the rainforests of Guyana in South America, greenheart is an evolutionary marvel. It is so dense that it does not float in water. It is virtually immune to rot, termites, and marine borers. It is harder than oak and has a natural fire resistance. You can hold a blowtorch to a block of greenheart, and it will char but struggle to ignite. However, the use of tropical hardwood eventually sparked an environmental controversy.
In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as awareness of rainforest deforestation grew, the city faced pressure to stop using Greenheart. Activists argued that the Brooklyn Bridge shouldn't be maintained at the expense of the Amazonian ecosystem. In recent renovations, the city has experimented with other materials and sustainable sources, including a wood called ipe, another iron-hard timber, and even investigating synthetic composites. But the clomp-clomp sound of shoes on timber remains the signature soundtrack of the crossing. It creates a tactile connection to the 19th century. You are walking on a boardwalk in the sky. The maintenance of this wooden deck is a constant, grueling battle. The planks can warp, crack, or come loose. A loose plank is a tripping hazard, and on a bridge famous for the 1883 stampede, tripping hazards are taken very seriously. Maintenance crews patrol the walkway, looking for pop-ups, nails or screws that have worked their way out due to the vibration. In the winter, the wood gets slick with ice. The city cannot use standard corrosive road salt on the wood because it would drip down onto the steel cables and cars below. Instead, they use a special acetate-based de-icer, or simply sand. The result is a gritty gray paste that coats the walkway from December to March, turning the romantic stroll into a trudge through gray sludge. The bridge's role as a lifeline was proven most dramatically in the 21st century during two events that defined modern New York, the September 11th attacks and the Northeast blackout of 2003. On September 11, 2001, as the Twin Towers burned and fell, the subway system shut down. The bridges and tunnels were closed to vehicular traffic. Manhattan was an island under siege. The Brooklyn Bridge became the primary escape valve for hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the dust cloud of lower Manhattan. The iconic photos from that day show a sea of humanity, covered in gray ash, walking somberly across the wooden planks towards Brooklyn. The bridge, which built to unite the cities, was now evacuating one into the other. There was no panic this time, unlike 1883. There was a terrified silence, broken only by the sound of shuffling feet and the sirens screaming in the distance. The bridge, which stands in the shadow of where the towers stood, absorbed the shockwave of history. The dust of the World Trade Center settled into the crevices of the bridge's limestone towers, embedding the DNA of the tragedy into the structure itself. 2 years later, on August 14, 2003, the lights went out. A massive power failure cascaded across the Northeast grid, plunging 50 million people into darkness. The subways stopped dead in the tunnels. The elevators froze. The electric commuter trains halted. Once again, New York turned to its oldest technology, walking. And once again, the Brooklyn Bridge was the artery. This time, the mood was different. It was a hot summer evening. As the sun set and the skyline remained dark, a rare, unnerving sight of black monoliths against a purple sky, the bridge filled with commuters. But without the terror of 9/11, the atmosphere turned into something approaching a festival of survival. Strangers shared water bottles. People directed traffic with flashlights. The bridge, which requires no electricity to function as a bridge, was the only thing that worked perfectly. It was a reminder of the resilience of Victorian engineering. John Roebling's design didn't need a microchip or a power grid. It just needed gravity and tension. As the moon rose over the darkened city, the bridge was a silver ribbon of moonlight and flashlight beams, a river of light flowing over the black water. However, the boring reality of the bridge involves a legal and administrative quagmire known as jurisdiction. Who actually owns the bridge? Today, it is the New York City Department of Transportation, or DOT. But the bridge spans navigable waters, which makes the water underneath the jurisdiction of the U.S. Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers. The air above it is controlled by the FAA. This layering of bureaucracy makes any renovation a nightmare of paperwork. For example, when the city wants to paint the bridge, they must build containment structures to catch every chip of paint so it doesn't fall into the river, violating EPA rules. They must ensure the scaffolding doesn't hang too low, violating Coast Guard clearance for ships. They must ensure the cranes don't go too high, violating FAA airspace, though the towers are already obstacles. A simple paint job involves federal, state, and city agencies, leading to a boring mountain of permits that is taller than the bridge itself.
There is also the forgotten matter of the bridge plaza. In the original design, the approaches to the bridge were meant to be grand public squares. In Brooklyn, this was realized to some extent with Cadman Plaza, but in Manhattan, the approach was notoriously cramped and ugly, famously known as Newspaper Row because of the major newspaper headquarters, the World, the Tribune, the Times, that clustered near City Hall to be close to the information flow from Brooklyn. Over the 20th century, the reconfiguration of car ramps destroyed much of the pedestrian grandeur of the Manhattan entrance. It became a concrete spaghetti of on-ramps and off-ramps, hostile to the human walker. Recent urban planning efforts have tried to reclaim this, trying to rediscover the gateway experience that Roebling intended, but the demands of the automobile continue to choke the entrance. Let us look deeper into the cables themselves, specifically the suspender ropes. These are the vertical wires that hang from the main curved cables and hold up the deck. There are 1,520 of these suspender ropes. Unlike the main cables, which are permanent, the suspender ropes are designed to be replaced. They are the sacrificial limbs of the bridge. Over time, the bending and twisting of the deck cause these ropes to fatigue near the connection points. Replacing a suspender rope is a delicate operation. Workers must attach a temporary jack to take the load of the deck at that specific point. They tension the jack, the old rope goes slack, and they unpin it. Then they pin in the new rope and release the jack. It sounds simple, but doing this 150 feet in the air, with the wind blowing and the bridge vibrating from traffic, is a feat of nerves. In the 2010s, a major project replaced all the suspender ropes. The old ropes, cut into sections, were actually sold as souvenirs or scrap. If you bought a piece of Brooklyn Bridge cable on eBay during that time, you likely own a piece of a suspender rope, not the main cable. The bridge also has a temperature problem, or rather, a thermal expansion reality. The roadway is segmented. It has finger joints that allow the road to expand in the summer and contract in the winter. If these joints seize up due to rust or debris, the expanding road has nowhere to go. It can buckle, creating speed bumps of concrete, or worse, it can push against the towers, introducing stresses the stone was not meant to take. Keeping these joints clean and greased is one of the unglamorous, boring jobs that keeps the bridge from destroying itself. We must also consider the stay cable vibration. The diagonal stays, the web, have a tendency to vibrate in rain and wind. This is a phenomenon called rain-wind-induced vibration. Water rivulets form on the cable,
changing its aerodynamic shape, and the wind makes it gallop. This vibration can be violent. In the past, engineers have had to install dampers, shock absorbers on the cables to tame this motion. If you look closely at the diagonal cables today, you will see cross ties, thin wires connecting the cables to each other. These are not part of the original design. They were added to stop the cables from banging into each other during storms. It is a fix upon a fix, a constant tuning of the instrument. The bridge also casts a shadow, literally and metaphorically, over the neighborhoods of Dumbo, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, which includes the area under the Brooklyn Bridge, and the seaport. For a century, living in the shadow of the bridge was considered a curse. It was noisy, dirty, and dark. The rumble of the trains overhead shook the tenement windows. But in a twist of modern irony, the view of the bridge has become one of the most expensive commodities in New York real estate. The old warehouses where coffee and spices were stored have been converted into multi-million-dollar lofts. The Empire stores, the tobacco warehouse, these 19th-century brick structures that once served the working waterfront are now high-end food halls and theaters. The bridge, once the engine of industry, is now the backdrop for leisure. The Jane's Carousel, a restored 1922 carousel, sits in a glass box right next to the bridge, a fragile wooden toy next to the massive stone giant. The contrast is striking. The delicate painted horses of the carousel and the grim gray granite of the bridge, both survivors of a bygone era, now existing as tourist attractions. But the most poignant, boring fact might be found in the cemetery in Cold Spring, New York. There, in the plot of the Roebling family, lies the grave of Washington Roebling. He died in 1926, having outlived the completion of his bridge by 43 years. He spent those years in varying states of health, never fully recovering from the Caisson Disease, but his mind remained sharp. He collected minerals, he wrote, but he rarely visited the bridge. He didn't need to. He had built it in his mind 1,000 times. His tombstone is modest, but his monument spans the river. Emily Roebling, the woman who saved the bridge, predeceased him in 1903. Her contribution was acknowledged, but for a long time she was seen merely as a helper. Modern historians have corrected this, recognizing her as a de facto engineer. There is a plaque on the bridge dedicated to her, one of the few physical markers of her pivotal role. Without her diplomacy and her intellect, the bridge might have been abandoned, or Washington might have been fired, leading to a different, perhaps lesser design. The story of the bridge is also a story of steel chemistry. The wire used in the Brooklyn Bridge was crucible cast steel. This was the high technology of the 1860s. Today, bridge steel is made differently, in massive electric arc furnaces. The steel of the Brooklyn Bridge has a higher carbon content than modern structural steel, making it harder but also more brittle. This is why you cannot simply weld new steel onto the old steel. The heat of welding would crack the Victorian metal. Any repair to the bridge must be done with bolts and rivets, or high-tension bolts that look like rivets. You have to respect the metallurgy of 1869. You cannot force modern techniques onto it. It demands to be treated on its own terms. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, the Brooklyn Bridge has undergone one of the most significant changes in its operational history, a change that fundamentally alters the human experience of the span. For decades, the elevated wooden promenade was a chaotic battleground between two opposing forces, the leisurely tourist and the aggressive commuter cyclist. The narrow path, designed in 1869 for Victorian strollers in top hats and bustles, was never intended to handle the high-speed, lycra-clad bicycle traffic of modern New York. It was a zone of conflict, filled with the ringing of bells, the shouting of "Get out of the lane!" and the constant risk of collision. The serenity that John Roebling had envisioned, the breathing place, had been suffocated by the friction of overcrowding. In a move that prioritized safety over the dominance of the automobile, the city made a radical decision. In September 2021, a dedicated two-way bike lane was opened on the roadway level, taking over a lane that had previously been reserved for cars. For the first time, cyclists were banished from the wooden promenade. The effect was immediate and profound. The silence returned. Now, walking across the Brooklyn Bridge is once again a contemplative act. The anxiety of being run over is gone, replaced by the rhythmic sound of footsteps on timber and the distant hum of tires on the asphalt below. It was a reclamation of the bridge's original soul, returning the high ground to the pedestrian, the dreamer, and the slow observer. But the bridge faces a new existential threat that no renovation can fully fix: the rising ocean. When Roebling designed the bridge, the climate was considered a constant, stable force. Today, we know the sea level is rising. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the storm surge battered the Brooklyn waterfront. The water poured into the abandoned Empire stores. It flooded the subway tunnels, and it turned the streets of Dumbo into canals. The bridge itself, sitting high on its stone caissons, was safely above the surge, but its approaches were vulnerable. The saltwater intrusion into the basements and utility vaults around the bridge accelerates the corrosion of the hidden infrastructure. The bridge is an island of stone in a rising tide, a monument built for a geological era that is slowly slipping away. This brings us to the philosophical paradox of the bridge, often compared to the ship of Theseus. If you replace the suspender ropes, repave the roadway, swap out the wooden planks, repaint the steel, and reinforce the trusses, is it still the same Brooklyn Bridge that opened in 1883? The only original components that remain untouched and unchanged are the massive granite towers and the four main cables. Everything else is a replacement, a prosthesis. The bridge is not a static object, it is a process. It is a continuous act of maintenance. It exists only because thousands of people, painters, engineers, welders, inspectors, wake up every morning and decide to keep it standing. If we were to stop this maintenance for even 50 years, the bridge would begin to die. The rust would seize the joints, the cables would fray, and gravity, the patient enemy, would eventually win. Yet there is something in the granite that defies this fragility. The towers, built of rocks that are hundreds of millions of years old, will likely stand long before the steel has rusted away. In a distant future, perhaps thousands of years from now, if New York were to be abandoned, the cables might snap and the roadway might fall into the river, but the two Gothic arches would remain, standing like the ruins of Rome, rising out of the water to mark where the great city once stood. They are the tombstones of the industrial age, monuments to the belief that men could conquer nature. For the modern visitor, however, the bridge offers a specific grounding comfort. In a city of glass and steel, where skyscrapers are thrown up in a year and torn down in a decade, the Brooklyn Bridge feels permanent. It feels heavy. When you touch the limestone blocks of the tower, you are touching the same stone that Washington Roebling watched through his telescope. You are touching the same stone that felt the vibrations of the horse-drawn carriages, the steam trains, the trolley cars, and now the electric vehicles. It is a timeline made of rock. The grim reality of the bridge is that it was born in blood. The crushed foot of John Roebling, the paralyzed body of Washington, the Benz-racked bodies of the Caisson workers, the trampled victims of the stampede. But that grim history has been sublimated into strength. The bridge has absorbed the trauma and converted it into stability. It is a structure that has learned to carry the weight of the world. As night falls over the East River, the bridge undergoes its final transformation of the day. The sun sets behind the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, casting long shadows across the water. The office lights in Lower Manhattan flicker on, creating a wall of artificial stars. And then the bridge lights activate. The necklace of LEDs traces the catenary curve, the perfect mathematical shape that nature dictates a hanging cable must take. It is at this hour that the boring history becomes a lullaby. The frantic energy of the rush hour dissipates. The traffic thins to a steady, hypnotic stream of red tail lights and white headlights. The water below, dark and oily, laps against the stone piers with a rhythmic sloshing sound, the heartbeat of the estuary. The wind sings through the wire mesh, a low, constant hum that blocks out the noise of the city. If you were to stand in the center of the span at midnight, suspended between Brooklyn and Manhattan, you would feel a strange isolation. You are not in either borough. You are in the sky. You are held up by the tension of wires spun by men who have been dead for a century. You are safe. The bridge has held for 140 years. It will hold for another night. The story of the Brooklyn Bridge is not just a story of engineering. It is a story of endurance. It is the story of a father who dreamed it, a son who built it, and a wife who saved it. It is the story of the immigrants who dug the mud and the sailors who spun the wire. It is the story of the suicides and the daredevils, the poets and the painters. It is a story written in stone and steel, a narrative that never ends because the bridge never sleeps. It just waits, spanning the dark water, carrying us from one side to the other, indifferent to our fears, faithful to its duty. The cables are tight, the stone is cold, the river flows, and the great bridge stands. This is the reality of the Brooklyn Bridge, a reality of physics, of sweat, of blood, and of time. It is a boring reality, perhaps, stripped of the myths of magic, but in its boredom lies its magnificence. It does not need to do anything, but exist. It is the silent, unmoving anchor in a world of constant motion. And as the city sleeps around it, the bridge remains, the iron guardian of the night, watching over the deep black water, forever connecting the past to the future.